episode on OSRS ASMR, and the second part of our History Iceberg. So today we're going to be going through another 2 layers of the History Iceberg, and the topics are going to start becoming a little more interesting. With that, there will be somewhat more information on each topic as well. So I've made sure to mete out each one at least by a small amount compared to the previous video, so this might be a slightly longer video as well. I also had another comment from someone watching who mentioned that the volume was still not quite high enough, so I've raised the volume again, but perhaps I'll keep doing that incrementally if people still aren't quite finding it's loud enough, so apologies for that, guys. I don't think there's anything else I really wanted to mention. So, in which case, let's get straight into it and enjoy the third layer of the History Iceberg, and that layer is going to be called the Shallows. The first layer beneath the water, and we start with a familiar topic if you're a regular watcher on the channel: the Bronze Age collapse. So this was a period between 1200 and 1150 BC where a societal collapse took place in the eastern Mediterranean. It caused the period to be labelled a Dark Age, with Greek culture in particular receding to smaller villages rather than a unified kingdom. I do go into more detail on this topic in the Bronze Age ASMR video, so be sure to check that out if you're interested. But essentially, civilizations in Eastern Europe collapsed in this period, and the cause of which is unknown, although some of the possible causes are extreme droughts, revolution of the top-heavy political system, freak weather, or volcanic activity, and also invasion of the mysterious sea peoples, of which we have even less knowledge. And I think there's one of the topics a bit later on in the next layer gives some interesting insight into why the sea peoples may have invaded, which was new to me, so we'll come back to that one later. But yes, if you'd like more information on this one, please go and check out my other video. The next topic is lost books. Now, I wasn't really sure what this one meant, so I've taken a bit of a punt on it, but I think this may be about the fire of the Great Library of Alexandria. The story goes that while Ptolemy had Julius Caesar besieged in Alexandria in 48 BC, Caesar decided to set the docks of the city alight. This caused a fire to rage through parts of the city and eventually burned the library, where an estimated 40,000 scrolls were lost. side of the fortress would be almost impossible to attack, so it's the perfect defensible position. Later though, Masada and the lands around it were used by the Jewish population during their rebellion against Roman rule in 66 AD. Harrowingly, the fortress was used as a final defence by the Judean rebels known as the Sicarii when the Romans were close to quelling the rebellion. The story goes that once the Romans had built siege towers tall enough to scale the walls, a handful of women and children managed to hide in a cistern, while the remaining 900 rebels were ordered to end their own lives rather than become Roman slaves. So that's truly awful. Awful ending to that story, but honourable. Taking their own lives rather than living one as Roman servants. After this awful event, the site became a ruin for the majority of the next 2 millennia, but has recently been excavated and is now host to tourists and also many Jewish youth groups who make pilgrimages to the site. So there you go, one of the unknown stories of the time, which only survived due to the handful of women and children who hid themselves in order to tell it. As they say, history is written by the victor, but in this case it's also written by the survivor. I'm sure the Roman story of the siege would have been very different in order to glorify the conquest. So next we have Livia, or as her full name is Livia Drusilla, and also known as Julia Augusta. She was Emperor Augustus's wife and was influential in counselling him on how to run the Roman Empire. However, she's also reputed to have had a more sinister side. In an attempt to ensure the imperial succession for her son Tiberius, she is alleged to have caused the death of many of his rivals, including Marcus Claudius, Gaius, and Lucius Caesar, Agrippa, Postumus, and Germanicus. Even if you don't recognise these names, that doesn't really matter too much. The point is, each of these people carried great influence and power in Rome. So as you can tell, she had a bit of a reputation for, perhaps quite a feared reputation amongst the upper class. As such was her reputation, that she was also alleged to have killed her own husband, Emperor Augustus, by lacing his favourite figs with poison, although this is mostly conjecture. All of this led to her having many in the upper circles of Roman politics who despised her, but the reality was that she was probably a loyal wife and reliable mother to her son Emperor Tiberius, although he also found her overbearing. Regardless, she started the Julio-Claudian dynasty, which would last for around 100 years. So next we have the black pepper cost, which is actually one of my favourite topics on this iceberg. It's a nice general knowledge topic, and it really did surprise me, having learned some of these facts, considering how common black peppercorns are nowadays. But a little bit of information for you. Black peppercorn actually originates spice was considered a luxury item, afforded only by nobility or the very rich. In fact, the spice was such a luxury item that it was even used as an alternative for ransom payments, dowries and taxes, and was reportedly worth its weight in gold. This meant that pepper earned the moniker Black Gold and the King of Spices. Now that's quite astounding, considering you can now walk into any restaurant in the world and be offered the spice free of charge. And this didn't just stop at pepper. Many spices that are frequently seen in supermarkets were just as exotic and expensive, including ginger, cinnamon, cumin, and saffron, which was perhaps the most exotic of the spices. But the way I see that is, food back in the medieval period in Europe would either have tasted bland, salty, or perhaps herby, unless you were royalty. So, having learnt that, I think I'm much happier living in the world that we live in today, with so many spices and condiments readily available to us. Thebes. So, this was a bit of a tough one, as there are actually two cities named Thebes from the ancient world, one in Greece and the other in Egypt. The Greek city is possibly most well known as the city-state ruled by the mythical Oedipus, who some of you may recognise if you're familiar with any of Sigmund Freud's studies. Ironically, the city was also apparently famous for pederasty at the time. So, yeah. The city was also an important city during the Mycenaean era, but seemingly became just another city-state following the Bronze Age collapse, battling for control of Greece against Sparta and Athens. The Egyptian city of Thebes had fewer tales about it, but perhaps more history. The Egyptian city was first inhabited in 3200 BC, and its ruins lie in what is now Luxor. The city acted as the capital of ancient Egypt through much of the Middle and New Kingdom, which was spread over a period of 1,000 years. To give you a bit of an idea, that's probably about as long as London has been the capital of England, about 1,000 years. In ancient Egyptian culture, Thebes was perhaps the most venerated city for ancient Egyptians and was an important cult centre. Thebes was later conquered by the Romans and eventually declined to a mere village by the time the Romans had left in the 1st century AD. However, some of the ancient sites that are around even today are considered marvels and are also considered a World Heritage Site by UNESCO. These include the Luxor Temple, the Karnak, as well as the nearby Valley of Kings and Valley of Queens. Although I've included details for the Egyptian Thebes, it's important to note that the actual name of the city was Waset, or at least that's what the native Egyptians called it. The name Waset was changed by Alexander the Great and the Ptolemaic Empire that followed him to Thebes to sound more Greek, and this stuck when the Romans later invaded. So, food preservation in times gone by was one of the most important bits of knowledge you could have, especially considering that refrigerators are a 20th century invention. But But what you may be surprised to know is just how many different methods were used to preserve food in ancient times. The most obvious are boiling and heating your food, essentially cooking in general, which helps to kill any microbes. Cultures in India practiced burying rice, which allowed it to be stored for several months in dry conditions. Curing food has been important since as early as 12,000 BC, and this is done by drying the food in the hot sun. This would be then improved upon further by smoking the food or salting it. And fermenting was another interesting way to preserve your food, in particular for water, which in the medieval period was potentially dangerous to drink. However, once it had been fermented into beer, it was then free of microorganisms from the boiling of the water, and in addition now had the nutrients added from the barley and wheat. Lastly, sugar was used to preserve a lot of food, although sugar canes were not discovered until rediscovering the Americas. Until that point, European cultures would preserve fruit by storing them in honey. Imagines. So this one was a bit of a tough one to get any information on, but here's what I've got. Imagines is a selection of two books, the first written by Philostratus of Lemnos, and the second by his grandson, Philostratus the Younger. Both books were written around 200 AD and detailed the author's visit to an art exhibition in Naples. The audience was meant for the author's 10-year-old son, so the descriptions of each piece of art was written in a way that is directly addressing him. I personally love this. I think it's a lovely piece of history. Too much of history is wars and governments, so knowing that this father-to-son book has survived for almost 2,000 years restores some of my faith in humanity. This idea that it was essentially like a postcard sent by this father back to his son. The translations are easily accessible on the internet, and I had a read through some of the first book while writing this section. The art being described is a mixture of mythical scenes and real places, and people. And I have to say the language used is fairly challenging to read, but the descriptions that are detailed are brilliantly written. It really does fill your imagination. And as a running theme, there's another book that we'll be looking at a bit later on, which is very much in the same way. The language used, I guess, is because of the translations, almost talk in a very funny dialect, almost a very old way of talking. But it's so descriptive and really helps you picture what the author's trying to get across. The Murex is a type of sea snail which have very large and pointy shells. Certainly not the sort of snail you'd want to step on. And you should be able to see a picture of one just on your screens at the moment. So, yeah, quite a lethal shell. What's remarkable about the snail is that it can exude a yellowish fluid, which can be used as a purple dye once it has been exposed to sunlight. This colour was referred to as royal Tyrian purple, and it was very highly sought after in the age of antiquity in Greece and in Phoenician society. The name Murex was used by Aristotle to thus making it one of the oldest classical seashell names still in use by the scientific community today. The dye itself, though, became a hallmark of royalty, as the name may suggest. Unfortunately, it took tens of thousands of glands from the snails to dye even a small piece of fabric, but once the dye was applied, it took on a property that made it unique. While most dyes of the time would slowly fade and wash away, Tyrian purple, as it was also known, would only intensify in colour with wear. So if you can imagine that, in this ancient time that probably all the royalty and certainly the upper circles of religious class, such as priests, more than likely wore garments that were of this purple colour, and it showed status due to how rare and expensive the dye was. So the Antikythera Mechanism is considered to be the oldest found analog computer ever discovered. When using the term computer, I don't mean the type to have a screen and a keyboard, but instead a device used to compute a task on behalf of its user. This particular mechanism is believed to have used a variety of copper cogs to help plot the locations of the different planets in the solar system to within an accuracy of 1 degree every 500 years, which is incredible for that age. It's a mystery as to who created the device, although one theory suggests that it may have been the ancient Turkish astronomer Hipparchus, the very same person who invented trigonometry in any case, and the device was so technologically advanced for its time that nothing surpassed it for the next 1500 years, as scientists remarked that the precision and craftsmanship of the device was something similar to Swiss watchmakers by the 1600s. That's remarkable. To give you an idea of how accurate that 1 degree for every 500 years would be, I suppose. So if we're talking about the device calculating the movement of the planets in the solar system, and we're talking about 500 years, so 500 times around the sun, 1 degree of accuracy. I suppose if we I'm not really sure how close that would be, but the only way I think I could give an analogy on that is if we think about perhaps a watch, like mentioned in this section, a watch that was going for 500 years, after time would more than likely, or perhaps have maybe missed a minute or so, or just become slightly out of sync with time. That's the sort of accuracy that we're talking about with this mechanism. So for 500 years, it may be just slightly out by 1 degree. I'm sorry, I don't really understand more of how the degrees work with the solar system, but if anyone does know, please feel free to leave a comment on that one. The Seleucid Greeks. So the Seleucid Empire was one of 3 empires left behind by Alexander the Great after his death, and was by far the largest, spanning from western Turkey all the way to India. The kingdom was founded by Seleucus I, himself one of Alexander the Great's closest generals. Although the subjects of this empire were from the Middle East and Asia, the nobility were Greek, like Seleucus himself, and thus the empire was considered a Hellenistic empire. For those interested, the word Hellenistic comes from the word Hellezein, which means to speak Greek or identify as Greek. And many of the kingdoms that rose from Alexander the Great's empire were considered Hellenistic, as they were ruled by his generals, his Greek generals. So over the years, the Seleucids warred with the other adjacent kingdoms and were eventually wiped out by the Romans. And so it's assumed that whatever was left of the Greek nobility at the time, that they had just assimilated into the culture around them and slowly become more Persian or more Iranian. But through those nobles, Greek culture had been imprinted onto the lands of the Middle East and Asia for almost 300 years in what would be termed Hellenization. So even after the Greek nobility was gone, the Greek culture was still there, left behind. Very similar to how Roman culture has been left behind in all areas of its empire, so conquest and occupation seems to have that effect. The mountains of the moon. So in ancient times, explorers were fascinated with the River Nile, and many Greek geographers attempted to follow the river to its source. And I mean, why wouldn't you? It was probably the most famous river of that period. It basically fed one of the largest and most well-known kingdoms of the day in Egypt. And the river delta that leads into the Mediterranean was a huge hub of trade in ancient times. So, of course, you'd be very interested to see where the river led and was born. Bearing in mind that this was considered by many the longest river in the world, so this was no easy feat either. But eventually, a merchant by the name of Diogenes claimed to have found the source of the Nile at a group of massive mountain ranges which flowed into lakes. These were named the Mountains of the Moon by the Ugandan locals because of their snow-capped peaks, although Diogenes was only partially right, as by modern estimates the water from the mountains only partially feeds the Nile, but his theory was widely accepted for 1700 years. Until this theory was debunked, however, the rest of the world believed Diogenes' claim, and in fact many geographers drew maps of the mountains of the moon, cutting the entire continent in two, or others detailing the mountains to be located in what is today South Africa. In reality, the mountains are in fact set between Uganda and the Democratic Republic of Congo, and are also known as the Rwenzori Mountains. The Rwenzori Mountains. Okay, so now we're coming on to one of my favourite topics of this iceberg so far, and that is Silphium. The Silphium plant was an ancient plant used by cultures in classical antiquity for various different things. Some of the plant's uses were to treat sore throats, fever, indigestion, aches, pains, and warts. It could be eaten as a vegetable and secreted as sap, which was was delicious and could also be fed to sheep in order to tenderize their meat. Apparently, this made mutton so tasty that a modern comparison would be to look at the popularity of Wagyu beef in Japan. Although perhaps the most remarkable use was its apparent effectiveness as a form of contraception, making it perhaps the earliest form of contraception in human history. In fact, the popularity of the herb is suspected to have caused its extinction, as the flower reportedly was lost to the world during the Roman era. Unfortunately, we'll never have the chance to use this apparent wonder medicine. However, there is a chance the plant is still used in a different way in everyday life. That's because the typical love heart shape that we've become so accustomed to is theorized to have originated from this plant, with silver coins found from 600 BC showing the plant in a heart shape. There are a few theories about how this wonder plant went extinct. First of all, the plant itself is extremely fussy and would only grow in an area around modern Benghazi in eastern Libya, despite the best efforts of Roman and Greek botanists. Within this area, all of the harvesting of the plant was undertaken, as well as the grazing of the plant by sheep. So it's easy to see how, due to its popularity, the plant may have been wiped out from overuse. Another possibility is that the plant is actually a hybrid and potentially sterile due to this. So, for those not aware, sometimes when plants cross-pollinate with other plants, hybrids can be made, and usually, not always, but sometimes, the offspring of those plants would be sterile. They won't be able to reproduce, and in fact, you do also see that in the animal kingdom as well, in fauna as well as flora. So, for example, the mix of a horse and a donkey, which I can't remember the name of it, I think it's like a mule or something like that, is sterile. And likewise, we have the offspring of a tiger and a lion, which I believe is a liger, or you can have a tion. I think it depends on which species was the male and which was the female. But in any case, this hybrid is also sterile. So if the Silphium plant was a hybrid as well, perhaps it meant that at one point there were two plants near each other in Libya which were cross-pollinating to create Silphium, but perhaps the parents are now no longer in contact. So there is some hope, and that's not all either, as only a handful of plant diversity surveys have actually ever been completed in Libya. So there's a chance, however small it is, that it could still be out there, and it's just being mistaken for another Mediterranean weed. So perhaps one day we'll find out. Shipwrecks. Now this one was a little vague, as of course there have been shipwrecks all over history. You could say they've been littered all over history, and all of the time. But something cool that did come up when I checked out ancient shipwrecks, though, were recent ships found at the bottom of the Black Sea, a picture for which you should see up on your screens at the moment. Apparently, the ships had sunk so deep that the typical wood-eating organisms find it impossible to live, and so the ships remain perfectly preserved thousands of years later. And see. I mean, it's almost as if it was, without, you could almost raise it from the bottom and resail it once again, with perhaps just a few repairs made here and there. Another type of shipwreck found are those of Roman origin, discovered in the Mediterranean. Although the ships themselves are not so well preserved, their cargo certainly can be, and most of the time the cargo is found as jars or urns thought to have carried wine or olive oil. But with those sorts of shipwrecks, please do feel free to find some pictures of them yourself. But you'll see that immediately the structure of the boat is almost unrecognisable compared to these wrecks found in the Black Sea, which are really quite cool. Egyptian grain. So I think this may be referring to the different grain and wheat that the ancient Egyptians may have used on a daily basis. These include Coruscant and Emma grains, both of which were used during the time of the pharaohs. So apparently modern day grains, such as wheat, are hybrids of different forms of ancient grains, the two above included. Due to this, modern grains have taken on different characteristics and have become processed, arguably leading to modern wheat being unhealthy in comparison, thanks to the bleaching and stripping it goes through. This all stems back to wheat in the 1960s, which had started to be crossbred and genetically tampered with, but it's still up for debate just how unhealthy modern wheat is for you. The main thing people generally tend to agree on is that ancient grains contain many more nutrients than their modern cousins, such as higher levels of vitamins, protein and fibre, as well as other health benefits. So if you want to know the secret to a long-lasting life, take the pharaoh's diet. Pederasty. I'm going to skip over this one very quickly, as once again I'd like to keep the videos all PG, but essentially, to give you a very general explanation of this one, this was essentially a type of relationship practiced by ancient Greeks that are not okay by modern standards. If you really do want to research this one yourself, feel free, but I would suggest keeping safe search filters on for it. Moving on. Eleusis. So this is another one of the quite cool, interesting ones that I've researched on a little more than the rest. But Eleusis was, and still is, a suburban area near Athens. It is known for having had a considerable fortress in ancient times, but was perhaps better known for cult practices undertaken in the region. The most famous of which was known as the Eleusinian Mysteries, which were held on behalf of the cult of Demeter, and lasted for around 2,000 years. Originating from the Mycenaean period, these mysteries were accessed through different levels, typically depending on how many times you had participated, with those on their first trial only allowed a small way into the mystery, while those who were experienced being granted additional access to chests or doors which revealed more secrets. Although the rites were known throughout the Greek world, those that initiated in the rites were sworn to absolute secrecy and were consistently preserved since antiquity, or at least the secrets were preserved. ceremony may have involved visions and the conjuring of an afterlife, which could have been caused by a psychedelic substance induced by a drink called kykion. Some scientists believe that the psychoactive agent in the drink was either ergot, which is a fungal parasite, an opioid of some kind like a poppy, or DMT, which would have made the drink similar to modern-day ayahuasca. Any one of these substances could easily have conjured hallucinations powerful enough for the user to think they were communicating with otherworldly powers. So it basically, to me, sounds like an ancient escape room experience, but for people on trippy drugs. There are also known to have been several famous participants of the ritual from Roman times, including Commodus, Marcus Aurelius, Hadrian, and Augustus Caesar. The Minoans. So the Minoans were a Bronze Age civilization who inhabited the island of Crete and were named after their famous ruler, King Minos. As the story goes, under the palace of Knossos, the capital of Crete at the time, there was a great labyrinth which the fabled Greek hero Theseus had to explore, with nothing but a gold thread to help him find his way out. Once he reached the end, he was forced to face a deadly minotaur, which is the head of a bull and the body of a man. Outside of myth, the Minoans were actually an influential kingdom in the eastern Mediterranean, while only inhabiting such a small island. They had influence as far as the Middle East on the Canaanite culture, and as far west as Italy. Although they inhabited Crete in the Aegean Sea, they were fundamentally a different culture to the ancient Greeks, although they are credited with helping to influence Greek culture after their own culture had died out, the cause of which is contested, with some believing they were invaded by the Mycenaean Greeks, while others believe a local volcanic eruption and tsunami may have done the trick. Interestingly, they were also thought to have been the culture which originally inspired the myth of Atlantis, due to their intrinsic relationship to the sea, which surrounded their island and built powerful navies and merchant fleets due to this fact. And we have now Scottish Brochs. So Brochs are essentially Iron Age hollow towers built on the northern tip of Scotland and in the Orkney Shetland Islands. The building of these towers by the people of that time is remarkable in its own right, but the use of them is a matter of controversy. At first, these were thought to be fortifications used as defence against invaders, although that has recently been replaced with the idea that these were more likely stately homes for the higher members of society. Due to the pottery found and the craft of the build, there is also some speculation that they were not built by natives at all, but instead by immigrants from further south due to the Roman invasions of Britain. This last point has of course led to some claiming that this is an attempt to discredit the indigenous Scottish people, and so to this day it is still unclear what their purpose may have been and who built them. In any case, considering the British Celtic culture of the time was not well known for their feats of masonry, it makes these structures all the more impressive. Of course, the exception to that being the feat of creating Stonehenge, but generally speaking, they weren't known for their is going to be quite a bit longer than first anticipated. Perhaps I'll make the video. Perhaps we'll make it one layer, and we can always move on to a second one later. Yes, I think so. So, I'm sorry guys, I did say it would be a 2-tier video, but there was just such a lot of information to go through on this tier that, well, it makes more sense for me to stop the video now, as it's almost at an hour that I've been recording, but I'm sure after I've made some changes and edited the clip, it will more than likely come down to a much lower time, perhaps around 50 minutes. So, with that in mind, I don't really want to get a video of an hour and 40 minutes out to you, so we'll leave it there for tonight, but I'll be sure to get tier 4 out very soon, and I'm hoping you're all really enjoying this new series. I'm really enjoying researching it, and I can tell just looking down the iceberg that some of these topics towards the bottom are going to be really tricky to deal with, but it should be a bit of fun for us to learn some of these weird and fascinating things. And if these videos are something that you'd like, perhaps I'll try a different one in the future, a slightly different take, maybe a sci-fi or a different kind of history iceberg. So let me know what you think in the comments. But for now, we'll leave it there on the third layer of the history iceberg. I hope you all have a good night's sleep, and until next time,